This evening's talk is titled, See What the Buddha Saw. And I think I'll start out with historically what it characterizes as his first early experiences. Sometimes called the three sights, sometimes called the four sights, sometimes called the three marks of existence, four marks of existence. And as the story goes, when he left the palace one day after I think he was in his 30s probably, but had been married for some time, since he was 16 or so, and had been protected from anything by his father. But he managed to get out on his own a little bit, and the first thing in the story, as the story legend goes, the first thing he saw was someone who was very, very ill, sickness. Saw that form of suffering. The next time he went out, he saw someone who was extremely old, aging. So suffering, impermanence, sickness and aging. The next time he went out, he saw a corpse, someone who had died. So he saw sickness, aging, and death. And the next time, he was getting pretty bummed by this time, you can imagine. Next time he went out, probably thinking, now what am I going to see? He saw a mendicant, a sannyasin, or someone who had renounced the worldly life and entered the religious life, religious path. And he probably, who knows what actually happened, but probably talked to that person. And sometime thereafter decided that this might be a way to relieve suffering. This might be a way, as some stories have it, the person that who was living the life of a renunciate or sannyasin, mendicant, was happy. And so this led to his going into leaving home, going into shaving his head and so on, and all the other things that probably went along with that. I think tradition has it that he met a couple of teachers. I don't recall their names even though I read them. And he studied a little bit with one, then moved to the next, studied with them, and then went off on his own to, it's hard to know exactly what happened, but apparently went into some kind of, going without food, going without sleep, going without clothes, trying to somehow work with the whole idea of suffering in a really direct, increase it so that he could somehow see what this was. What is suffering? Can he actually overcome this? Can he see what is true beyond his thoughts about it, beyond his opinions, ideas, and so on, and everything he's been told? And the story has it that the first teaching he gave was on the Four Noble Truths. I don't remember the long name of that teaching. But life is suffering. The cause is wanting things to be different. The goal is a cessation of that situation, and the path is conventionally talked about as the Eightfold Path, and I like to say the Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, or discipline, which takes in the first 6 pretty well, and discipline, meditation, and wisdom or insight. The fundamental thing that he saw was that everything is dependently arisen. Nothing comes, nothing, he saw egolessness, he saw that nothing comes from its own side as a separate being, even though it keeps looking like that. That if we look deeply, we see that this separation that we continually maintain and insist on, which could be called, could look like this, contraction. We contract into our separateness. We pull in. When we become threatened, we pull in, contract, separate into our identity, who we think we are. This contraction may not be that obvious. It could be very gentle turning in. Just like kind of closing the door on something. Might not make much of a sound at all. The sitting practice of meditation, holding very still and observing how the mind, how the consciousness, how your particular karma works, how your particular way of shutting down, which might be probably is totally different than the person right next to you. Interesting, isn't it, how we can look at another person and see the way in which they're confused and shut down? Pretty amazing. We can see someone and see the way they're not exactly being honest with themselves. I sometimes say that if this person is your friend, then it's a person that can see that, but loves you so much and feels such affection for you, they're not going to point it out to you. And if the person is your enemy, then they'll use that against you. Difficult as it is, the way in which we see this, the way in which we understand this, is to continually and insistently and repetitively return to seeing that difficulty over and over and over again, to see that contraction, to see the way we personally turn it off or jump to conclusions or separate ourselves out or operate out of you could say, hide behind an opinion, refuse to look any further. Well, this is what I think and that's the way it is, and end of any kind of investigation. The minute, the second, the hour, the day that you grasp at an idea, a conclusion, an opinion, even if everyone agrees on it, even if you think it's obvious, the investigation shuts down. There's no more, because now we have it, now we know who we are, now we know what we do, now we understand. So kind of grasping at relative truth. And what makes it also difficult is there's all kinds of proof that what we're saying or what we're putting forth or what we're grasping at is relatively makes sense, is provable. Makes it much more difficult to go beyond that. So those of us who are very lucky aren't able to use that as a way to be temporarily, artificially happy. We are miserable anyway. It's always interesting to look around and see who smiles and who doesn't. So that's not much. Are there any questions? Put yourself in my place. Go up here and try to talk about something like that. Yes, sir.
How can someone relate to pushing away or hiding out in front of a teacher or sangha?
I'm not sure I follow. I'm anxious to answer it or respond to it, but I'm not sure I'm following specifically. I'm not sure. Go ahead.
It seems like as a contrast between when you're sitting in front of me or when you're in my presence and when you're not in my presence, there's more of a hiding out that occurs, or a recognition or an awareness of hiding out.
Okay, then what's the question?
How can I see more clearly what that is?
Sit a lot. Exercise or stretch, or the actual witnessing part of what arises, what falls away, rather than what thinks about what arises and what falls away, which is just part of just another thing that arises. We tend to use those things as ways of avoiding the complete spaciousness within which we are arising. The very nature of awareness is space. So say sitting, practicing, studying, Sangha is very important. That's why we do so much studying here, to continually put yourself in that situation over and over again. More? Jason?
You had mentioned the 3 marks of existence, and also sometimes the four marks of existence.
Yes.
And the one that you initially taught me was suffering, impermanence, and selflessness, or no self. How do those relate to the sickness, old age, death, and the mendicant?
How does it look?
I can see the correlation between no self and the mendicant, but then as far as the suffering and the impermanence, it doesn't necessarily seem clear as to which ones those necessarily relate to.
Ask me the question again.
Are they the same, the 3 marks of existence and the 4 marks of existence?
So, I'm not sure what I said in the past. I'm not saying I didn't say something, but 3 are sickness, aging, and death, and then peace. Sickness, aging, death, and peace, or the religious path or spiritual path. So, I think that's the way I was doing it.
You taught me dukkha, anicca, and anatta is suffering, impermanence, and no self before.
That's pretty good. How do they look hooked up to you?
I'm not sure.
Not coming back to me. Yes, Yogado.
How does seeing what the Buddha saw, the 3 or 4 marks of existence, help us to awaken?
So the initial, I was bringing that up because that's initially what he was seeing, but eventually he saw no self in the skandhas. He saw emptiness. He saw suchness. He saw that things are exactly what they are, minus anything you might add on to it. And anything you add on is extra. It's not that it's not, you can't do that. Of course you can do that, but it's extra. Well, it seems to be necessary for each person to see for themselves what is true, to actually see what is true. But we get hung up in time, we get hung up in the illusion of time, we get hung up in the illusion of success and failure, we get hung up in the illusion of all of the terrible political things that are happening. It's like we see this, well, you can't mean this. Well, this is ridiculous to go and meditate while all this terrible stuff is happening. Well, there's the seduction. Those the worldly dharmas will draw you right out of this room, right down the street, right into some other kind of dynamic of pushing and pulling and warfare. More?
So how do we not get pulled into that?
To see that you get pulled into it. To see that that we're pulled this way and we're pulled this way. And what makes it so difficult is it's justifiable. When we see that, when I say it's justifiable, it's reasonable. It's a reasonable situation. Somebody's doing this or doing that, and it makes sense, and we have to stop that. We have to insist. We have to, even the words we use, the most peaceful person will say we need to fight back. You know, the war on this and the war on that. We use relative terms all the time to justify the intense anger that you see in the streets over things that are obvious. All of the people, I hate to get into all the political stuff because we see enough of that on the news, but we have people who are they look like robots. They're wearing uniforms that completely dehumanize them. You can't even see their faces. They wear all kinds of shields and everything, and then they're paid a lot of money. And of course they have families, have to have a job, so and they can justify that by whatever philosophy they've been given. It's okay to do this. It's okay to, you can do this. These people are wrong. These people are creating problems. Even though, like in the case of the global warming and all kinds, there's so many things that are going on. And we're drawn into taking a very similar kind of activity. We go and we fight against those situations. And you might say, well, how else could we do it? Shouldn't we go in and object? But one of the things that hasn't been understood or seen that I've tried to talk about, but it's difficult, is to say that what happened a couple of weeks ago or last week or whenever it was, it didn't just come out of nowhere just in the last year and a half. This kind of thing has been going on for a long, long time in different forms. Just like our own confusion about ourselves and our minds and who we are and how everything works and why they're suffering, why we suffer, why we have difficulty in one situation and not in another, why the one that we had difficulty with is now we're not having difficulty with that. Awareness, the more awareness you can come in. The ego does not want to hear about this awareness bull. It doesn't want to hear about it because it doesn't have any ropes and pulleys or handles or credentials or nothing is there. The most intelligent, highly intelligent person will just say that, well, this you can't do that, this can't work. We've got to do this or this and this. You set your spiritual path aside and come back, take off your robes and come back and put on your helmet. I know I was in the military. I know what kind of propaganda machine, and even back then it was pretty strong, and it's even stronger now. Yes.
If if we see delusion or see what the Buddha saw, will we know then what to do? What needs to be done?
Yes. But you have to see it. I'm not confused about what to do. But you could also say, and others might say, well, yeah, you're just a lazy old man with your robes and your little temple. But you can say whatever you want to. People cannot hardly stand to not have some kind of opinion on everything or some kind of a judgment. People will even ask you to force you into a corner if you they make a statement, you make a statement. People quite often, the knee-jerk reaction is that good or bad? Is that good or bad? Not even realizing what they're actually showing about their mind, the way the mind works. Plus or minus, plus or minus. Come on, cough it up. Plus or minus. Relative truth, does it work or doesn't it? We're doing this constantly. And seems to be necessary to bring a tremendous amount of awareness in there. And it's not that that doesn't operate on some level. We're not trying to throw all that out and say, no, we just need to live in this completely open dimension of cosmic soup. Lisa?
When we get to the part about death, impermanence,
Yeah.
it seems really easy to see it in the academic sense, to say, yeah, this person died, clearly we're all impermanent. How do we keep looking at it long enough to feel it, to know impermanence, not just in the academic sense?
I think besides sitting practice, to watch the way thoughts arise, they hang around for a bit and they disappear, to also see it in our everyday life and walking to our house, from our house to the car, and to notice that we create with our imagination, we create a continuity that makes it look like everything is happening and going on. We create some kind of a we add all this up to make it look like there's some kind of ongoing situation. But sickness and aging and death is right around the corner. Sickness is any minute. Death is the death of your thought patterns, the death of people around you. Aging is, everything is constantly deteriorating and going back where it came from. Either someone brought up recently when I was talking about natural hierarchy of the leaves are in the air and the roots are in the ground. And someone, I don't know who it was, say, yeah, but the leaves fall out of the trees and go into the ground. And that's a good point. I don't think it fit my model at the time I was talking, so I ignored it. Suzanne?
When we notice these pushes and pulls in daily life, how do we work with them?
It's may not sound so helpful, but just watch them. And notice, as we watch them, notice the way we add on to it. Some things are so easy to add on to, it's almost like they have a big vacuum on them, causing you to come on and add an opinion, an idea, a reaction. So when something arises, some things are real soft. There are things that arise and we look and we it's easy to give it the benefit of the doubt or give it some space. Other things look like a loaded gun pointed at us. And that's difficult to just give it space because we distinguish between good and bad and easy and hard, and we constantly buy into relative truth over and over and over again. More? Kevin?
What does the attachment and aversion look like to the Tathagata?
What does it look like to one who comes thusly? have more, you just don't know how to ask it. See me narrow my gaze?
What if I asked it a different way?
Okay.
What, how does attachment, how does attachment and aversion arise in the wisdom mind?
So I see what you're going for, but it's just things arising and things falling away. So in the wisdom mind, not much happens. Things happen, but there's not a polarity there. More? Yes.
What do you mean when you say there isn't polarity there?
We're not picking and choosing. We may see aversion, we may see attachment, but we're not picking and choosing. We're not saying this is wrong, this shouldn't be, or this should be happening here, and this shouldn't be happening. So we're not mixing it up in terms of some kind of pushing or pulling or buying into some kind of propaganda about something. It's not that there isn't something occurring, but it's not what? It's not separate. Thanks. Yeah, it's not separate. And that's what it seems necessary to be able to see. That it's not, that whatever arises, it has its own character, it has its own color, its own texture, its own speed and activity. It's functioning, it's moving, it's slowing down, it's speeding up. All kinds of things are happening like that. But since they're not separate, you don't see anything separate from anything else. It's called pratitya samutpada, or dependent origination, or the 12 links in the chain of existence is the way of stretching it out into a line. This happens and that happens and that happens. It's not to say that you couldn't have grasping, or you couldn't have desire, or you couldn't have any one of those becoming without the other ones, but it's unlikely. And if you did have it, then you'd be awake. Yes.
Is saying not two the same as saying not separate?
Mhm.
Why make the distinction?
Hmm?
Why do we have two different phrases?
Just not separate is just a general way of saying all the 10,000 things are, the two part comes in with me and everything else. So not two, it's not, there's this, which looks like one situation, me, you and your stuff, but you and your family, you and your community, you and your world, you and the trees, you and the ground, you in this room, you and everyone you meet, not separate. Or not two. And the way of saying that in the Yogacara tradition is perception only, or consciousness only. There's just consciousness. There's no one who's being consciousness, they're conscious, and there's no thing to be conscious of. I would love it if I could just say that, give you one sentence that would clarify that for everyone completely. This room would empty out and I'd never see you again. Not separate. This is what brought about this talk about what the Buddha saw. I say, see what the Buddha saw, not separate. So maybe I start out with the provisional part of it. First he saw that, then he saw that, then he saw that, and then he saw everything. Nothing was separate from anything else. And that was his awakening. He wasn't even separate from the daughters of Mara, who came and tried to jar him out of his samadhi, or his awakening. Yes.
When you say what the Buddha saw, are you speaking of his eye organ seeing?
It's part of it. But all the senses, including the mind, is not separate from anything else. What he saw was the Buddha. Everywhere he looked, he saw the Buddha. He had awakened, and as he awoke to, he was the awakened one, and what did he awaken to? Not separate. He awoke out of his contraction, out into not separate. Everywhere he looked, he saw someone who thought they were separate from him, but he saw they were not separate. So it looked kind of humorous until you realize that you're making it too light of the whole situation, just going to increase the suffering of someone, because they don't see the humor in that. If they're feeling terrible and you're chuckling, but it's humorous because it's as Trungpa Rinpoche says in his I think it's in Myth of Freedom, has a chapter in there. Is it Myth of Freedom that has a chapter called Cosmic Joke, or is it Cutting Through?
Must be Myth of Freedom.
Myth of Freedom? It's a big joke. We got 15 minutes. I could use a really good question here.